He thought forcing her to perform would expose her as nothing, but in less than 5 minutes, that same room would forget how to breathe. The grand recital hall of Westbridge Academy shimmered under warm chandelier light, its polished wooden stage reflecting the quiet prestige that had defined generations of elite musicians, and at the center of it all stood Professor Alan Reeves, a man whose reputation carried as much weight as the Steinway concert grand positioned beneath the spotlight, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate, his silver hair combed with deliberate precision, every inch of him radiating authority as rows of students sat upright in anticipation, their expensive instruments resting beside them like badges of honor, while along the back wall, nearly invisible to anyone who didn't care to look, Clara Bennett pushed a cleaning cart with soft, measured movements, her gray uniform blending into the background as if she were part of the building itself, her presence acknowledged only when necessary and forgotten just as quickly, which was exactly how the system preferred it. For 3 years, Clara had moved through these halls like a whisper, arriving before sunrise, leaving long after dusk, her world defined by the quiet rhythm of mopping floors and polishing brass railings, her name rarely spoken, her story never asked, and yet her eyes, calm, observant, steady, had seen everything, from trembling first-year students struggling through scales to award-winning performers basking in standing ovations. She had watched it all in silence, absorbing the music without ever touching the keys, or at least, that's what everyone believed. Professor Reeves adjusted his cufflinks and scanned the room with a faint expression of impatience, his sharp gaze settling briefly on a nervous student seated at the front, a young man clutching sheet music with trembling fingers, and with a subtle shake of his head, Reeves exhaled through his nose as if already disappointed, the weight of expectation hanging heavy in the air, because today's recital was not just another performance. It was a showcase for visiting judges, Dr. Helen Strauss and James Caldwell, 2 names that could open doors to international careers or quietly close them forever, and Reeves intended to demonstrate nothing less than perfection. But perfection, as it turned out, was about to take an unexpected form. A faint squeak echoed across the marble floor as Clara's cart wheel caught a seam in the tile, just loud enough to draw a few annoyed glances from students who had never once considered the person responsible for keeping their pristine environment intact, and Professor Reeves paused mid-sentence, his expression tightening ever so slightly as his eyes drifted toward the back of the room, landing on Clara with a look that carried both irritation and opportunity, as though an idea had just taken shape, something sharp, something calculated. "You," he said suddenly, his voice cutting cleanly through the room, and for a moment, no one moved, because no one expected him to be addressing her. But when his gaze remained fixed, the silence shifted, and Clara slowly straightened, her hands still resting on the handle of the cart, her expression neutral, unreadable. A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the students as whispers began to form, the kind of low, dismissive murmurs that thrived in environments built on hierarchy. And Reeves stepped forward slightly, his tone now carrying a deliberate edge of performance. "We speak so often about musical interpretation," he continued, turning partially toward the judges while keeping Clara within his peripheral focus. "Yet we rarely consider how an untrained ear might approach something complex." And a few students exchanged knowing smiles, already sensing where this was going, the setup unfolding like a familiar script. Clara didn't move, didn't protest, didn't shrink. She simply stood there, her posture quiet but grounded, as if she had heard this kind of tone before, as if she understood the weight behind it and chose not to react. And that stillness only seemed to encourage Reeves further. "Tell me," he said, now fully addressing her, his voice softened just enough to sound almost polite. "Have you ever played before?" The question hung in the air, and for a brief second, the room held its breath, not out of respect, but out of curiosity, the kind that comes just before laughter. And Clara's eyes met his, steady and calm, as though measuring something unseen, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "A long time ago," she said. A few students chuckled under their breath, the sound light but unmistakably dismissive, and Reeves allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, the kind that suggested control, that suggested he already knew how this would end. "Perfect," he replied, gesturing toward the piano with an open hand, the polished surface catching the glow of the overhead lights like a stage waiting for its next act. "Why don't you join us, then?" he added, his tone now unmistakably theatrical, designed not just to instruct but to entertain, "and give us your interpretation." The room shifted, attention sharpening, anticipation building, because what they expected was failure, something awkward, something forgettable, something that would reaffirm everything they believed about talent and status and who belonged where. And as Clara slowly stepped away from her cart, her worn shoes echoing softly against the floor, no one, not the students, not the judges, not even Professor Reeves, had the faintest idea that they were about to witness something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Clara Bennett did not rush, and that was the first thing that felt wrong to everyone watching, because people who were about to embarrass themselves usually moved with hesitation or urgency, but she moved with neither, just a quiet, measured pace that echoed softly across the polished floor as she walked toward the piano, her figure small against the grand stage yet somehow impossible to ignore, and the faint murmurs that had filled the room began to shift into something more focused, more curious, though still laced with quiet amusement, as a few students leaned toward one another whispering guesses about how quickly this would end, how awkward it might become, while Professor Reeves stepped aside with a composed expression that masked his anticipation, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, as if observing a demonstration he had already mastered in his mind. Clara reached the bench and paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished edge of the instrument. And for a moment she simply stood there, not playing, not speaking, just looking at the keys as though reacquainting herself with something long forgotten, yet deeply familiar. And in that stillness there was a subtle shift, something almost imperceptible, like the air itself had changed, though no one could quite explain why. And from the front row Dr. Helen Strauss narrowed her eyes slightly, her professional instincts catching on that pause, that quiet confidence that did not match the situation, while James Caldwell adjusted his glasses, leaning forward just enough to signal interest rather than dismissal. Behind them, a student stifled a small laugh, the sound quickly swallowed by the heavy silence that followed, because even the expectation of failure seemed to hesitate in the presence of something it did not yet understand. And Clara slowly took her seat, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands resting gently in her lap before lifting with deliberate care toward the keys, not trembling now, not uncertain, but steady, controlled, as if guided by memory rather than thought. Professor Reeves tilted his head slightly, watching closely, waiting for the moment when uncertainty would reveal itself, when the first wrong note would confirm everything he believed. And yet that moment did not come, at least not in the way he expected, because instead of immediate sound, there was another pause, longer this time, deeper, as Clara closed her eyes for the briefest second, drawing in a quiet breath that seemed to anchor her completely. And when her eyes opened again, they were no longer searching, no longer cautious, they were certain. Somewhere in the room, a chair creaked softly as someone shifted, the tension building not from excitement, but from confusion, from the growing sense that something about this was not unfolding according to the script everyone had silently agreed upon. And even the students who had been smirking moments ago now found themselves watching more carefully, their expressions less certain, their laughter fading into quiet attention. Clara's fingers hovered just above the keys, not yet touching, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. And then, with a motion so gentle it was almost invisible, she pressed the first note, a single tone that rang out clear and pure, filling the hall with a resonance that seemed to linger longer than it should, and the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a ripple across still water. Because that note did not carry hesitation, it did not carry uncertainty, it carried intention, and Dr. Strauss's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, her pen pausing mid-air as she listened more closely, while Caldwell's expression shifted from polite interest to something sharper, something more analytical. Professor Reeves remained still, his face composed, but there was a flicker there, something small and quickly hidden, as though a question had just formed where certainty once lived. And Clara continued, her second note following the first with quiet precision, then a third, then a sequence, each one placed exactly where it belonged, not rushed, not forced. but unfolding with a natural flow that felt less like performance and more like memory returning to life. And the room, once filled with expectation of failure, began to settle into a silence that was no longer dismissive but attentive, the kind of silence that listens. No one laughed now. No one whispered. And even those who did not yet understand what they were hearing could feel that something had changed, that the story they thought they were watching had already begun to move in a direction they had not anticipated. And as Clara's hands moved with growing confidence across the keys, the distance between who she appeared to be and what she was revealing began to stretch wider with every passing second, until the room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something it could not yet name. The melody did not rush to impress, and that was what unsettled them most, because every student in that room had been trained to perform, to demonstrate skill with precision and speed, to prove their worth within the first few seconds. But Clara Bennett played as if she had nothing to prove at all, her hands moving with a quiet assurance that ignored the invisible pressure hanging over the stage, each note unfolding into the next with a natural grace that felt less like execution and more like conversation. And somewhere between the fourth and fifth measure, something inside the room shifted in a way no one could deny. Dr. Helen Strauss lowered her pen completely now, her attention no longer divided between evaluation and observation, but fully captured by the sound itself. Her eyes narrowing not in skepticism but in recognition, because what she was hearing carried nuance, restraint, and a depth of interpretation that could not be learned from textbooks or rehearsed in practice rooms. While James Caldwell leaned forward further, his fingers resting against his chin as if trying to understand how such control could come from someone who had just admitted to playing a long time ago. And even the students who had once smirked now sat still, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and reluctant admiration. Professor Alan Reeves, however, remained standing near the edge of the stage, his posture unchanged, but his composure was beginning to crack in ways only the most observant could see, because this was no longer unfolding according to his expectation. This was no longer a harmless demonstration meant to reinforce hierarchy, and though his face remained calm, his eyes followed Clara's hands more closely now, searching for a flaw, a mistake, any sign that this moment would collapse back into something predictable. But instead, the music continued to build, slowly at first, like a story revealing itself layer by layer. Clara's fingers moved across the keys with increasing fluidity, her left hand anchoring the melody with a steady, grounded rhythm while her right hand traced delicate patterns that rose and fell like quiet waves. And there was something unmistakably personal in the way she shaped each phrase, something that went beyond technical accuracy, as though every note carried memory, experience, something lived rather than learned. And the room responded to it without realizing, breaths slowing, shoulders easing, the usual tension of performance dissolving into something softer, something more human. A student in the third row who had been whispering earlier now sat with his mouth slightly open, his earlier amusement replaced by a quiet disbelief, while another lowered her eyes, as if suddenly aware of how quickly she had judged someone she did not understand. And even the air seemed different now, heavier with meaning, quieter with respect. Clara did not look at the audience, did not glance at the judges, did not acknowledge the weight of their attention. She simply played, her focus entirely on the instrument before her, as if the rest of the world had faded away. And in that isolation, there was a kind of freedom that none of them had ever seen on that stage before. The melody began to swell, growing richer, more expressive, each phrase expanding with a confidence that no longer needed to hide behind restraint. And when she reached a particularly intricate passage, one that would have challenged even advanced students, there was no hesitation, no visible effort, just a seamless transition that carried the music forward with quiet authority. And that was when Dr. Strauss exchanged a brief glance with Caldwell, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Professor Reeves shifted his weight slightly, the smallest movement, but one that betrayed the tension beginning to build beneath his composed exterior, because this was no longer a question of whether Clara could play. That answer had already revealed itself. This was something else entirely, something far more difficult to reconcile. And for the first time, the man who had orchestrated this moment found himself without control over how it would end. Clara's hand slowed just enough to let the melody breathe, the notes lingering in the air with a softness that felt almost fragile. And in that fragile space, something deeper began to emerge, something that reached beyond technique and into emotion, into something that could not be measured or critiqued, only felt. And as the final phrase of that passage unfolded, the room remained perfectly still, no movement, no sound, only the quiet realization that what they were witnessing was not a mistake waiting to happen, but a truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. The music did not fade, it deepened, and with each passing second the distance between expectation and reality stretched until it could no longer hold. Because what Clara Bennett was creating was no longer just a performance. It was something that reached into the quiet spaces people rarely allowed themselves to feel. And the melody began to swell with a richness that carried both strength and vulnerability, her hands moving with a balance of precision and emotion that felt almost impossible to replicate, as if every note had been lived before it was ever played. Dr. Helen Strauss felt her chest tighten slightly, not from confusion but from recognition, the kind that comes when artistry crosses into something personal, something that bypasses analysis entirely. And she lowered her gaze for a brief moment, as if grounding herself, while James Caldwell's expression softened in a way none of his students had ever seen, his posture no longer rigid with evaluation but open, attentive, almost reverent, and even the smallest sounds in the room had disappeared. Completely, no shifting chairs, no whispered comments, not even the quiet rustle of clothing. Only the sound of the piano filling every inch of space with something that demanded to be heard. Clara's fingers moved faster now, but not with urgency, rather with clarity, each motion deliberate, each transition seamless. And when she reached the emotional peak of the piece, something changed in her expression, something subtle yet undeniable. Her eyes no longer simply focused but distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the room itself. And that was when the music shifted again, not louder, not more complex, but deeper, carrying a weight that settled into the silence like truth. Finally spoken aloud. A student in the front row blinked rapidly, his earlier confidence completely dissolved, while another lowered her head slightly, her hands clasped together as if trying to process what she was feeling, and somewhere near the back, a quiet inhale broke the stillness, quickly followed by the unmistakable sound of someone holding back emotion, because what Clara was playing had moved beyond demonstration, beyond skill, into something that could not be dismissed or categorized. Professor Alan Reeves stood perfectly still, but the control he had once carried so effortlessly was slipping, not in visible panic, but in the quiet unraveling of certainty, because he could no longer place her, no longer define her within the boundaries he had constructed, and that uncertainty pressed against him in a way he was not accustomed to. His eyes fixed on her hands as if searching for explanation where none existed. Clara allowed the melody to soften, her touch becoming lighter, more fragile, as though the music itself was beginning to breathe, and in that softness, the room leaned in without realizing, every person drawn closer by the quiet intensity of the moment. And then, with a final sequence that unfolded like a gentle release, her hands slowed, the last notes stretching into the air with a resonance that lingered long after her fingers lifted from the keys. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, not a single movement, not a sound, just a silence so complete it felt almost unreal, as if the entire room had forgotten how to respond. And then Dr. Helen Strauss closed her eyes briefly, a single tear slipping free before she could stop it, her breath unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with being moved. While James Caldwell exhaled slowly, his composure intact but visibly shaken, his gaze fixed on Clara with a depth of respect that had not been there before. No one clapped, not yet, because applause would have broken something too delicate, too honest, and Clara remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting quietly in her lap, as if allowing the music to settle completely before she stood, her movements calm, unhurried, as though nothing extraordinary had just taken place. And when she finally rose, the room was still silent, not out of confusion anymore, but out of something far more powerful, something that did not need to be spoken to, be understood, because in that moment, Every person in that hall knew they had just witnessed something that could not be undone, something that would stay with them long after the last note had faded. No one moved, not at first, because the silence had become something sacred, something that no one in that room wanted to break too quickly, as if even a single clap might shatter what had just been created. And Clara Bennett stood there beside the piano, her posture calm, her expression unchanged, not seeking approval, not waiting for praise, simply allowing the moment to exist without trying to claim it. And it was that quiet dignity that made everything feel even more profound. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Dr. Helen Strauss brought her hands together, a single, deliberate clap that echoed softly through the hall. And it was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried weight, recognition, and respect. And after that first sound, the rest followed, one by one, until the entire room rose into applause that was no longer polite or rehearsed but genuine, full, and overwhelming. The kind of response that could not be faked or forced. Students who had laughed minutes earlier now stood with expressions that carried something entirely different. A mix of humility and disbelief, their applause steady, their eyes fixed on Clara with a respect they had not offered before, while James Caldwell joined in without hesitation, his expression still composed, but his eyes reflecting something deeper, something that acknowledged not just skill but presence. And Professor Alan Reeves remained still for a moment longer than everyone else, his hands at his sides, his mind working through a reality he had not prepared for, because this outcome had never been part of his design. When he finally raised his hands to clap, the gesture felt different, not performative, not authoritative, but quieter, more restrained, as though each movement required acknowledgement of something he could no longer dismiss. And that shift, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. Clara inclined her head slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement that carried neither pride nor apology, and without waiting for the applause to fade completely, she stepped back from the piano, her movements as composed as they had been when she approached, as if the extraordinary had not changed her at all, as if she had simply revealed something that had always been there. Dr. Strauss rose from her seat, her expression composed but her voice carrying an unmistakable warmth when she spoke. "Miss Bennett," she said, and the room quieted again almost immediately, attention shifting not because it was commanded, but because it was earned. "How long have you been playing?" The question lingered, not as a challenge, but as genuine curiosity, and Clara met her gaze with the same calm steadiness she had shown from the beginning, her answer simple, unembellished. "Since I was a child," she said, and there was no need to explain further, because something in her tone suggested that the story behind those words was longer than anyone in that room could fully understand. James Caldwell nodded slowly, his voice measured as he added, "You have not just practiced music, you have lived it." And there was no exaggeration in his words, only recognition, and for a brief moment, the distance between judge and performer disappeared, replaced by something more human, something rooted in shared understanding. Professor Reeves stepped forward then, the movement drawing attention not because of his authority, but because of what it represented, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was a weight beneath it that had not been there before. "Miss Bennett," he began, pausing just long enough to choose his words carefully, "it appears we have underestimated you." And though the statement was simple, it carried an acknowledgement that reached beyond him alone, touching everyone who had participated in the same quiet judgment. And Clara did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, because she did not need to correct him, did not need to elaborate. She simply met his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, a gesture that accepted the truth without demanding anything more from it. The room remained still again, but this time the silence was different, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but settled, grounded in a realization that had arrived too late to prevent the mistake, but just in time to understand it. And as Clara turned and walked back toward her cart, her steps steady, her presence once again blending into the edges of the room, no one saw her as invisible anymore, because something had shifted permanently, something that could not be undone. And though the stage remained where it was, and the piano still gleamed under the lights, it no longer belonged to the same story it had before, because that day, without raising her voice or asking for attention, Clara Bennett had changed the way that room understood both music and the people they thought they already knew. The applause had faded, but its echo lingered in ways no one could quite explain, settling into the walls, into the polished wood of the stage, into the quiet thoughts of every person still standing in that room. And as Clara Bennett returned to her cart, her hands resting once again on its handle, the familiar object seemed almost out of place now, as though it belonged to a different version of the world that had existed just moments earlier, before everything had shifted. She did not rush to leave, did not draw attention to herself. She simply resumed the quiet presence she had always carried, but the difference now was unmistakable, because the room no longer allowed her to disappear, not truly, not anymore. A few students exchanged glances, uncertain of how to act, as if the rules they had always followed had suddenly changed without warning, and one by one, small gestures began to emerge, a student stepping aside to clear her path, another offering a quiet nod, subtle acknowledgments that spoke louder than any apology they might have tried to form. Clara noticed, but she did not react, her expression remaining calm, steady, as if she understood that recognition, like judgment, often arrived too late to matter in the way people expected. At the front of the hall, Dr. Helen Strauss and James Caldwell remained seated, their attention no longer on the schedule of performances that had once defined the day, but on the shift that had taken place before them. Something far more significant than any planned recital. "We need to speak with her," Strauss said quietly, her voice measured but firm, and Caldwell nodded in agreement, his gaze following Clara's movement as she approached the side exit, her steps unhurried, her presence still grounded in the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the performance. Professor Alan Reeves stood nearby, his posture composed but his thoughts far from settled, and when Strauss rose from her seat, he turned slightly, as if anticipating her words before she spoke them. "Professor Reeves," she said, her tone professional but edged with something more direct. "Why is someone of her ability working here unnoticed?" The question was simple, but it carried weight, and for a moment, Reeves did not answer, not because he lacked words, but because none of them felt sufficient, and that pause said more than any explanation could have. "I was not aware," he finally replied, his voice controlled, but the certainty that once defined it had softened, replaced by something closer to reflection. Strauss studied him for a brief moment, her expression unreadable, then turned her attention back toward Clara, who was now only a few steps from the door, her figure framed by the soft light filtering through the glass. "Miss Bennett," Caldwell called out, his voice calm but carrying easily across the room, and Clara paused, turning slightly, her eyes meeting his with the same quiet steadiness that had never wavered. "Would you join us for a moment?" he asked, not as a command, but as an invitation, and that difference did not go unnoticed by anyone listening. Clara hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but as if measuring the moment. Then she nodded once and stepped away from her cart, walking back toward the front with the same measured pace that had defined every movement she had made that day. The room watched again, but this time there was no judgment in their gaze, only attention, quiet and respectful. When she reached the judges, Strauss rose to meet her, closing the distance not as an authority figure, but as someone seeking understanding. "Your performance," she began, her voice softer now, "was extraordinary, not just in technique, but in expression," and Clara listened without interruption, her posture relaxed, her hands resting loosely at her sides. "Have you considered returning to the stage?" Caldwell added, his tone thoughtful, as if the question itself carried possibility rather than expectation. Clara's gaze shifted briefly, not away from them, but inward, as if touching something distant, something that had once been closer than it was now. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was a depth beneath it that had not been present before. "That part of my life ended a long time ago," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of decisions, of circumstances, of paths not taken or perhaps taken too far. And for a moment, no one responded, not because they did not know what to say, but because they understood that some stories were not meant to be explained in a single moment. Strauss nodded slowly, her expression softening, and Caldwell exhaled quietly, as if accepting that the answer, while final, did not diminish what they had witnessed. Behind them, Professor Reeves remained still, listening, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more complex. And as Clara turned once more toward the exit, the room did not try to stop her, did not call out again, because there was a growing understanding that what she had given them was not something to be claimed or repeated on demand. It had been offered once, freely, and that was enough. The door opened softly as Clara stepped through, the light beyond briefly illuminating her figure before it closed behind her. And though the room remained filled with people, with voices slowly returning, with the structure of the day attempting to resume, nothing felt the same, because something had been revealed that could not be unseen, a quiet truth that lingered in the silence long after she was gone, reminding everyone who had witnessed it that not all greatness announces itself, and not all brilliance seeks a stage to prove it. The door closed behind Clara Bennett with a soft click, and for a moment, the sound seemed louder than it should have been, as if it marked the end of something that none of them had fully understood while it was happening, and the room remained suspended in that realization, caught between what had just occurred and what it meant for everything they believed about talent, status, and recognition. The recital schedule still lay open on the music stand near the judges, untouched, forgotten, because continuing as if nothing had changed felt almost impossible, and yet the structure of the day demanded it, the expectation that performances would resume, that evaluations would continue, that life would return to its familiar rhythm. But something in the atmosphere resisted that return, something quiet but persistent. Dr. Helen Strauss slowly took her seat again, her fingers resting lightly on the table as she glanced at James Caldwell, and there was no need for words between them, only a shared understanding that what they had witnessed could not be measured against the criteria they had prepared, that it existed outside of the framework they had spent years refining. "We should continue," Caldwell said eventually, his voice calm but softer than before, as if even speaking required a different kind of care now, and Strauss nodded, though her attention drifted briefly toward the door Clara had just exited, as if part of her remained there, following the quiet figure who had just redefined the meaning of presence without asking for it. Professor Alan Reeves cleared his throat, stepping forward with a controlled composure that seemed almost practiced, though the subtle tension in his posture betrayed the shift beneath the surface, and he addressed the room with the same authoritative tone he had used countless times before. But something about it had changed, something that no longer carried the same unquestioned certainty. "We will proceed," he said, his voice steady, but the weight of those words felt different now, as if they were being tested against something deeper, something that could not be dismissed or ignored. And as the next student approached the stage, the usual anticipation did not return in the same way, because comparison had already taken root, not out of unfairness, but out of inevitability. The student played well, technically precise, carefully rehearsed, every note placed exactly as instructed, but the room did not respond as it had before, not with indifference, but with a quiet awareness that something was missing, something they had only just discovered, and that realization lingered in every performance that followed, subtle but undeniable. Students who had once played with confidence now carried a different kind of focus, one shaped not by competition but by reflection, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the piano, as if searching for something beyond the notes, something they had not known to look for before, and even the smallest imperfections seemed less important than the absence of that deeper connection they had just witnessed. Professor Reeves watched each performance with careful attention, his expression composed, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the rigid expectations he had enforced for years, because somewhere beneath his discipline, a question had begun to form, one that challenged the very foundation of how he had defined excellence, and that question did not offer easy answers. During a brief pause between performances, Strauss leaned slightly toward Caldwell, her voice quiet but firm. "We cannot ignore what we saw," she said, and Caldwell nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he responded, "We will not." And that simple exchange carried the weight of decision, though its outcome had yet to reveal itself fully. In the back of the room, the empty space where Clara's cart had once stood felt strangely significant, a reminder not of absence, but of presence that had been overlooked for far too long, and a few students glanced in that direction as if expecting her to reappear, as if hoping for another moment that would confirm what they had begun to understand. But she did not return, And perhaps that was part of what made it real, because it had not been a performance designed for them. It had been something offered without expectation, without agenda, something that existed on its own terms. As the recital continued, the structure slowly regained its rhythm, but the perspective within. The room had shifted permanently, subtle changes in posture, in listening, in the way each note was received, and even as the final performance of the day came to an end, the applause that followed felt different, not louder, not more enthusiastic, but more aware, as if everyone present now understood that what they had witnessed earlier was not something that could be repeated or replaced. And though the judges completed their evaluations, and the students gathered their belongings, and the hall began to empty, the silence that remained carried a new meaning, one that lingered long after the lights dimmed and the doors closed, because that day had not just been about music, it had been about seeing what had always been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. The hall had emptied slowly, but the silence it left behind lingered long after the last footsteps faded, settling into the corners of the room, like a quiet reminder that something had shifted in a way no one could reverse. And as the evening light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, Professor Alan Reeves remained standing near the stage, his gaze fixed on the piano that had become the center of a moment he could not fully explain. For years, he had believed that mastery came from discipline, from structure, from the careful shaping of talent through rigorous expectation. And yet what he had witnessed earlier did not fit into any of those categories, because it had not asked for permission, had not followed a path he could measure, and that realization unsettled him in a way he had not anticipated. Across the room, Dr. Helen Strauss and James Caldwell gathered their notes, though neither seemed particularly focused on the pages before them, their thoughts clearly elsewhere. And as they approached the stage once more, Strauss paused, her eyes drifting toward the empty space near the back wall, where Clara's cart had stood earlier, her expression thoughtful, almost reflective. "We cannot let this disappear," she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm certainty that did not seek agreement but expected it. And Caldwell nodded, his tone measured as he responded. "Then we do not treat it as an accident. We treat it as what it is." And though he did not elaborate, the meaning was clear, because what they had witnessed was not chance, not coincidence, but something that demanded recognition beyond a single moment. Reeves turned slightly, acknowledging their presence, and for a brief moment, the authority he had always carried seemed less rigid, less absolute, as if something within him had begun to shift, though he had not yet found the words to express it. "You are considering inviting her back," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Strauss met his gaze without hesitation. "We are considering giving her the choice," she replied, and that distinction hung in the air, subtle but significant, because it acknowledged that whatever came next would not be dictated by them, but by Clara herself. Outside, the evening air carried a quiet stillness, the campus pathways nearly empty as Clara Bennett moved along them with the same steady pace she had maintained all day, her figure blending into the soft glow of the streetlights, her presence once again unnoticed by most, though the world around her felt different, not because she had changed, but because something had been revealed that could no longer be hidden, at least not entirely. She reached the small maintenance building at the edge of the campus, setting her cart in its usual place with the same care she had always taken, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if the routine itself carried a kind of grounding. And for a moment, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle, her eyes distant, not lost in thought, but in memory. The music still lingered within her, not as sound, but as feeling, as something that had never truly left, only waited for the moment it could exist again. And though the performance was over, its presence remained, quiet and steady, like a part of her that had simply stepped forward for a brief time before returning to where it had always been. Back in the hall, Strauss and Caldwell prepared to leave, but not before exchanging one final glance, an unspoken agreement passing between them, because they both understood that what had happened that day would not end within those walls, that it would continue in ways they could not yet fully predict. Reeves remained behind, his attention still fixed on the stage, and as the lights dimmed one by one, the room seemed to settle into a different kind of quiet, one that no longer carried expectation, but reflection, and in that reflection, a truth began to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that could not be ignored, because for the first time, the measure of greatness in that room had shifted, no longer defined by position or perception, but by something far more difficult to overlook, something that had been there all along, waiting for the moment it would be seen. And somewhere beyond the walls of that hall, walking under the fading light of the evening, Clara Bennett carried that same quiet presence with her, unchanged, unclaimed, and entirely her own, while those who had witnessed it were left to reconcile the difference between what they had believed and what they now understood. Morning arrived quietly over Westbridge Academy, the soft glow of early sunlight stretching across the campus as if nothing extraordinary had happened the day before, and yet inside the walls of the music hall, the air still carried something different, something that had settled into the foundation of the place itself, refusing to be forgotten. Students returned with their instrument cases in hand, their conversations quieter than usual, their laughter more restrained, because even if they did not speak about it directly, they all carried the same memory, the same moment that had interrupted everything they thought they understood. Professor Alan Reeves stood alone on the stage before the day began, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the piano, his reflection faintly visible in its polished surface, and for the first time in many years, he was not preparing to instruct, not rehearsing expectations, but simply standing there, considering something he could not yet fully define. The door behind him opened softly, and Dr. Helen Strauss entered, her presence calm but purposeful, followed closely by James Caldwell, and there was no formal greeting, no need for ceremony, only a shared understanding that had already been formed. "We have made our decision," Strauss said, her voice steady, and Reeves turned to face them, his expression composed but attentive. "We would like to offer her an invitation," Caldwell continued, "not as a student, not as an assistant, but as an artist, on her own terms," and the weight of those words settled into the room, not as a proposal, but as a recognition long overdue. Reeves nodded slowly, not in authority, but in agreement, because whatever hesitation might have existed before had already been replaced by something clearer, something that no longer required justification. Later that morning, Clara Bennett arrived as she always did, her steps measured, her uniform unchanged, her presence once again blending into the rhythm of the building. But this time, the building did not respond in the same way, because the people within it could no longer pretend she was invisible. A student held the door open for her without being asked. Another offered a quiet, "Good morning." Simple gestures that carried a sincerity they had not possessed before, and Clara acknowledged them with a small nod, her expression calm, as though she accepted the change without needing to question it. As she moved down the hallway, her reflection passed briefly in the glass panels that lined the corridor, and for a moment, she paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, as if recognizing the space she occupied in a new way, not defined by how others saw her, but by what she had always known to be true. When she entered the music hall, the room fell into a subtle stillness, not forced, not dramatic, but natural, as if the space itself remembered, and at the front, Strauss and Caldwell stood waiting, their posture open, their expressions respectful, and Professor Reeves stood beside them, no longer positioned above, but alongside. "Miss Bennett," Strauss said, her voice warm but measured, "we would like to speak with you." And Clara approached with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through every moment. Before, her steps steady, her gaze clear, Caldwell extended a simple envelope toward her, not as an offer of obligation, but as an invitation, and Clara accepted it without hesitation, her fingers resting lightly against its edge as she listened. "What you shared yesterday," Strauss continued, "was not something we can categorize or measure. It was something that deserves to be heard, and we would like to give you that opportunity, if you choose it." And there was no pressure in her words, only possibility. Clara looked down at the envelope for a brief moment, then back at them, her expression thoughtful, not surprised, not overwhelmed, but reflective, as if weighing something far deeper than the offer itself. And in that pause, the room held its breath once more, not out of anticipation, but out of respect for whatever decision would come next. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, steady, and unmistakably certain. "I never needed a stage to know who I am," she said, and her words carried no resistance, no rejection, only clarity. "But I will consider it." And that answer, simple as it was, held more meaning than any immediate acceptance could have, because it came from a place that did not seek validation, only alignment. Strauss smiled gently, Caldwell nodded, and Reeves lowered his gaze for just a moment, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had changed, and Clara stepped back, the envelope still in her hand, her presence once again grounded in the same quiet strength that had never left her. The room remained still for a moment longer, not in suspense, but in understanding, because whatever came next would not define her. It would simply reveal more of what had always been there. And as the day continued, as the hall filled once more with sound and movement, something deeper remained beneath it all, a quiet truth that no one could ignore, because on that day, without demanding attention, without asking for recognition, Clara Bennett had reminded them of something they had forgotten. That dignity does not need permission, and true brilliance does not wait to be seen. It reveals itself when the world is finally ready to listen.